A very good evening. Welcome to Swarajya, and you're watching Swarajya Conversations. I'm joined by Dr. Anand V from the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations in Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Dr. Anand, very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sharon, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
It's always a pleasure to read your articles and to speak to you because you're the coordinator also of the China Studies Center, and I read your recent piece where you're talking about the demographic disaster that China is actually accelerating towards. And what are the worst of your fears, or rather, what do the Chinese fear the most at this point?
Yeah, certainly I don't have anything to fear, but the Chinese do have something to fear because if you look at the very crux of national power, right, at any given point of time, whether it is in history or whether it is today or maybe even in the future, I think demography is the key. We often talk about territory, we often talk about natural resources, but at the end of the day, it is the human beings which make or break the future, right? And this is something which even in the scholarly literature has been often been deliberated on. Like for instance, the classical geopolitical thinker uh, Halford Mackinder, he is the founder of what is known as the heartland theory, but in fact he has actually came up with another very important concept known as manpower, though today it's a politically it's not a it's a insensitive word, but I hope you can get the meaning of what it means. It's basically about the power of the human resources. And according to him, at that point of time, I'm talking about in the early 20th century, where the when he defined heartland, he said that perhaps the Soviet Union is the biggest threat to the Western world. But using his concept manpower, he emphasized that maybe rather than the Soviet Union, a much bigger threat could be Germany because of its ability to mobilize the so-called manpower. And if it takes over the heartland, that is the Eurasian core, it will then dominate the world. This was the biggest fear. So, right from that period, this concept of demographic power has been there, and it is key. And that is why, if you look at even in today's world and today's setting, we talk about data being the new oil, right? But where is all this data being generated from? This data is generated from people. And if you have a huge market in your own cyber world, you can generate your own massive sets of data which you can utilize for improving your own country's artificial intelligence through advanced machine learning techniques. So, in even in this future, when we are talking about great power competition, it is very much linked to demographic power, and that too the working population. Now, the problem with China is that its demographic window of opportunity is closing very, very soon. This closing of the demographic window is not something which is that rare or anything like that. In fact, most of the developed world, including its own neighbors like Japan and South Korea, their demographic dividend has gone, has dried up. Even South Korea in the past few years, they are on the demographic decline now officially. China is right now not under demographic decline. The rate at which its population is growing is coming down, which means that it is very soon. Some predict that at least in this decade itself, it is going to hit the peak, and then it is going to come down. So by the end of the century, we are looking at perhaps China not being the most populous country in the world, and perhaps not the country with the largest working population. That would be India in a few years or decades from now.
But does it have to be populous to be powerful? I mean, that's something of a notion that's come about, especially with the rise of China. But that's not the convention, is it?
It is not the convention, but it is a very important factor. It's not demography or geography or territory or any other factor. These are only factors which aid in the development of power. You can't just pin down one particular factor for determining the course of the national power. So, but demography certainly is one major aspect.
Right.
If you look at
Uh,
some of the most powerful countries today, I mean,
Yeah.
they are having significant populations, if not or some of the
Right.
most populous countries in the world.
The initial panic and the warnings indicated towards Japan, I think, was well received around the world. Everybody have been discussing Japan's demographic disaster for a very long time. But now that you've mentioned China and South Korea as well, does it have to do something with the entire region of East Asia? Is there some pattern that way, or is it limited to just to a few countries, perhaps?
This is not a regional pattern per se, though there can be regional factors involved. This is a global pattern. And the global pattern is something which we may also have to worry about in the future. And this global pattern is about the rise in living standards. As people say that failure is the stepping stone towards success. So similarly, successes can also become the stepping stone to failure. So this is one of those cases wherein you reach a certain amount of development in your economy, in your lifestyle, and you don't require to produce as many offsprings as you were at a point of crisis or at an economically more desperate time, right? And in today's world, we know that even in the cases which we are talking about, South Korea, Japan, I mean, young people, they are unwilling to marry, and even if they are married, they are unwilling to have children, which is further creating this issue. And this is not just in, as I told you, in East Asia. This you can find throughout in Europe, especially in the more advanced parts of Europe, in Scandinavia, uh, and other parts. So this is a global phenomenon. It has more to do with the changes in lifestyle and the living standards than with anything else.
And would you say that the Chinese concerns were accelerated due to the failure of one child policy, perhaps? And I think similar policies are being adopted in India and they are being planned in several states.
Well, the one child policy came up in a particular historical circumstance because China, as we see today, or China, which we could see in retrospect in the 1970s, is a far cry from what we see today. It is a totally underdeveloped, a country under starvation, a country without any opportunities. Right? Only with the rapprochement with the United States, which led to its recognition in the international system, and further, by Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, did it open out to the world? And again, it started becoming the world's factory as we know it today, right? So, for that matter, if you can look at it, how the Chinese economy itself has developed, uh, it has been quite astounding. One of the major uh, decisions which were made in the 1980s itself by the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping was to ensure that the population stays low because they want to transform this economy, a very rural uh, economy, into a modern economy which is at par with the developed world. That was what their ambition was. And with a huge number of population, with a growing number of population, that is not something they could manage. So, to ensure that the Chinese growth story takes off, they wanted to make sure that the population remains or the population rate remains low. And that was the major reason behind the bringing in of this one child policy. Of course, there are lots of debates about the one child policy and how it was enforced. It was very, very strictly enforced. A lot of the human rights advocates today won't find it appealing at all. Uh, but it did happen, and did happen until this decade, when slowly, in the early part of the last decade, it was realized that this has gone too far. Now we can't utilize this strategy anymore. It is not useful to us anymore. Moreover, if we continue this, it will be counterproductive for the Chinese economy, and that's when they thought of doing away with it, and they did away with it in 2016. And I think later on it was replaced with a three China policy, but now that is also off. And now they are urging people to have more and more children as possible.
Right. But is there an end to that ambiguity, or are the Chinese firm now that they want to focus on the population growth, perhaps?
They want to, and this is something which you can find throughout in whatever has been coming out of China, whether it is in the form of official pronouncements from the government or in terms of the media articles. They certainly want to increase their population, and because the thing is that now the fertility ratio has come beyond the or fallen beyond the critical level, that is 2.1. And because of this, they want to ensure that their population grows in a sustainable manner. And yes, the government is working towards it. The problem is regarding the efficiency of this or the effectiveness of this. uh, I see that this is something which is too late to be reversed, because now the Chinese are in such a standard of living. I'm not talking about all of them, but at least I'm talking about the ones who are residing in the cities, are the ones who are contributing the most to the economy.
Right.
They are not in that stage of life where they can now think of having more children, because remember, now all these people are actually the little emperors, or they are single
Mhm.
children, right? Because they don't have any siblings. So there is a psychological aspect to this. And on top of that, there is a financial aspect also, because you have to now look after one child earlier, and now you may be having multiple children if that is the case, and then you have to look after your parents also, right? And without anybody else's support, because there are no siblings, as I
Yeah.
told you. So it's a huge financial, in the Chinese terminology, it's not a burden, but let's talk about that particular aspect. It's a huge financial burden for the Chinese population, especially the young population. And
Yeah.
because of their hectic work schedules, again, uh, it is not something which is very feasible to have more children. And
Do
what
you
is
think
the
because of
guarantee?
growing technological prowess and the developments in technology that we see, whether it's machine learning, artificial intelligence, are people generally hesitant because they are afraid that they'll lose out their jobs to perhaps machines at some point in the future, if it's not already happening for that matter?
That is a universal kind of a thought process. That is a universal concern. But what I understand is that based on previous experiences, we know about the earlier industrial revolution. When the earlier industrial revolutions happened, whether it's the first, second, or the third, this is the fourth one. Certain jobs have been lost, but it's not an absolute lost. Some jobs are lost somewhere. It comes up on the other side. So similar things can be expected, though I won't be able to say on what fronts the new jobs may come up. One very important thing is that as of now, the artificial intelligence capabilities are not quite adept in for creativity purposes. So jobs which emphasize on creativity are the ones which are there for the future. And at the same time, the humans will actually be put more in employment on areas related to machine learning and other forms, so that they can always control and monitor the progress of the growth of artificial intelligence itself. So there are various multiple avenues
Right.
available perhaps in the future for jobs. It's, as I told you, one way it goes, the other way new opportunities come.
Yeah, for anybody who I speak to who observes and learns and tracks the activities and developments in China, what we hear are the interesting analogies, back from the country, especially if they've visited a conference or something. In the beginning of your piece itself, you mentioned some interesting anecdotes or terms that the Chinese use, such as black swans and gray rhinos. So, just to contextualize these warnings in the form of these messages that the Chinese put out. What exactly are black swans and gray rhinos, and why should the Chinese people be scared of that?
This is something which has come up recently during Xi Jinping's tenure about the probable risks which might come up. Because 2010s, the second decade of the century, was a time when a lot of warning bells started ringing in the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy, which was until now on that double-digit rate of growth, has slowly stabilized into officially at around 5-6 percentage. This is pre-COVID era. So there was a concern that about what will happen in the future about its economy. What if something unpredictable happens? And this unpredictability factor is what is being referred to in the black swan events, because as we know, swans are white, and the black swan probability of a black swan is a very less. And when it turns out, I mean, it is very obvious, you can't ignore it. So that kind of a threat is what being discussed in this black swan terminology. And one black swan event which is there before us, which happened 2 years ago itself, was the COVID-19. Then the rhino problem. Gray
Yeah,
rhino, as opposed to black swan, is something which is very. I mean, rhinos are gray, right? They are not
yeah,
black or white. So you, the problem is it's there, but you don't actually pay attention to it,
right.
right? So this is the case with the demographic dividend. Everybody knew that the Chinese population at the beginning in the 80s it was growing beyond limits, and then the curves were put in place. So it was obvious that the population will come down.
Right.
It was expected, but it was happening at such a gradual pace that only in towards the later phases they found out that this is actually a trouble which we need to deal with, and the system has been, I would say, quite slow in reacting towards this particular downturn.
In spite of a largely centralized system that they have in China. Now, what's this phenomenon of leftover men that you've written about? I found that to be very interesting, and that obviously I think is in reference to the one China policy,
It is
one
with
child
reference
policy. I'm
to
sorry.
one child policy because when this is a very traditional thinking, this is a reality that when couples in the late 20th century, and perhaps even now, when they are left with only one option for a child, they would want that child to be a male child and not a female child. So abortions were very frequent, or female infanticide was very much a commonplace in China as a result of this. And the impact of this is the dwindling sex ratio. So there are more females in China, disproportionately huge number of females today in China compared to, sorry, males in China compared to the females. So because of that, a lot of the men. That's why I spoke about the leftover men, right? And this further actually brings down the prospects for keeping the population at pace, or it even impedes the
Right.
policies which would raise the population.
I think in Japan, it's much more popular in that sense. But if you've observed the trends of population decline or rise in many of these countries, which are now being talked about, including the West, including the United States, obviously, because of the nature of the governments that are there, you may have seen differences in terms of how they want to tackle this problem. Do you see those differences in many of these countries?
Yes, there are in fact huge cultural roots to the responses which countries take. Like if you look at the Western countries, they heavily favor immigration. People from outside coming, settling, working, finding their partner, creating families, and creating a multi-ethnic society. That is there in the West. Well, not all part of the West, but the relatively more liberal, open parts of the West. Whether, like for instance, Scandinavia, Northern and Western Europe. or for that matter in the United States, where such kind of diversity is cherished. They call it the immigrant nation. Now, if you look at a country in the east, like for instance Japan is a very peculiar case here. Japan is one of those few countries where very few Japanese live outside Japan and very few foreigners live inside Japan. So it is, it's a proper nation state in that manner. And Japan has a huge has a huge impact of its history of isolation from the rest of the world, right? And because of all these reasons, they aren't quite welcoming of a policy of immigration. For a long period of time, they didn't even consider it. Today, they are considering it, but not without resistance, right? And it is, even if it happens, it is very difficult for somebody from outside to go and settle down in Japan, because the cultural differences are too vast. Because as I told you, the Japanese have created a culture which is quite unique, and it's not that easy to get accustomed to, or for that matter, for the Japanese to
Yeah,
feel more comfortable of others coming in and changing
yeah.
their culture for that matter. And because of these reasons, one of the options available for Japan, which they are also looking at, is again technology. So
Right.
today you find robots almost everywhere in Japan doing all sorts of jobs, including one of the biggest issues of a demographic society which has passed its demographic dividend, which is basically elderly care. A lot of robots are helping out the elderly Japanese residents. So that is one alternative which they are looking at, and though they are slightly opening up to this concept of immigration, but as I told you, it's very tough, and I'm not sure whether it will work out for the Japanese.
Mm.
So there are
And
huge
how are
cultural
the
differences
right?
impacting
And
these
how
respects.
are the Chinese incentivizing people who want to bear more children? Perhaps I'm sure that may be an aspect too.
Well, the Chinese work culture in the past few years have gone, let's say, from bad to worse. There is this whole concept of what is known as involution. Like you work and work and work without any rest or without any concern for your personal life. That is becoming a trend. We know about this in the case of Japan, which has happened. It's an established norm in Japan, which they are now trying to reconsider. But in China, it is getting mainstream, and because of this, a lot of responses coming from the other side, like the youth, which felt that this is just sucking the life out of people, and they are adopting what is known as a lying flat approach. That is, you do whatever that is very minimal to make sure that you earn a living, and you don't have big ambitions. Now the criticism to that is that if this is the case, then the Chinese population will become less ambitious, and because of which
Yeah,
China's again grand strategy of becoming a superpower won't work out. So that is another concern. So
yeah.
this is a dynamic which is happening in China as of now.
But I think there is a similar pattern in the West as well, although it's not so synchronous as it may be in China. It was known as the hustle culture, and everybody wanted to
Huh.
hustle. And now there is a resistance to hustle culture that it's very toxic, it's not good for your personal health, and that you must take a break.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
So
it
in that okay,
happens.
sorry.
No, it's a kind of a universalist thing that
Yeah.
it's like the pendulum goes too far, and then there is a need to drag it back.
Think there are commonalities, especially in the younger demographics, if you're talking about it, whether it's in Asia or in America for that matter. So,
Yes.
what are your predictions? How is this going to work out? Especially because we've seen how the Chinese tried to repair their demographic damage in the past, and it has never gone the way they want to. And it's perhaps something to do with the way in which nature works.
Yeah, well, it did go the way they wanted to until a certain period, and after which they kind of lost control. I think they miscalculated on when exactly they should intervene and keep it back on track. Right. So, as of now, I can't give you any predictions for the future because primarily because if you just go by the numbers, yes, I can give you a prediction that China's relative power would rise. It will peak a few years after its population reaches its peak, and then it will decline. But that kind of a prediction will not consider some of the qualitative aspects of the population because it's not just the size of the population which matters, it is also the productivity of the population which matters. As I told you, that the dialectic between involution and lying flat, right? So that is also very big. We see it today happening in India. This whole debate about how to use our demographic dividend, we see it as a huge potential, right? But this potential can be turned into a capability only if we properly address it. So
Right.
when you look at that particular part, there are a lot of uncertainties, and because of that, I can't give you a proper prediction. But as far as the quantities, as the numbers show, well, the Chinese have gone up. They will go up. They will soon face a downhill path.
And do you think the Chinese are equally concerned about the population being largely restrictive to the eastern parts, where it has traditionally seen a presence of, and now there are reports that they are trying to encourage more population growth in other parts as well, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, but I don't know to what extent it's actually working in their favor.
Now, this economic disparity, this geo-economic disparity in China is something which has a huge potential for China because it's like the fuel for the fire. Not everything is burning up at the same time. You keep something in reserve, and slowly you feed it into the furnace. So that for the Chinese, there is a lot of stock if you look at it from that point of view, because a huge portion of the Chinese economy still have to have a long way to go to match up with the Western standards of living, which is basically their ideal, which they want to reach by around 2049, right? To make China completely developed, kind of a superpower kind of a situation. So there is this huge potential to actually translate this into further growth. Now, again, if you look at the Chinese geography, around 80% of the Chinese populations live in the cities, which is concentrated in the eastern seaboard, and a small portion of it um, in that the Sichuan plain, which is a little bit interior, but nevertheless. But the other parts, the vast majority of China, which is interior towards its west of the coastline, they are underdeveloped and their potential is yet to be fully utilized. And this is where perhaps a rebalancing can be done. And as I told you, this excess stock of fuel can be released to further power the Chinese engine. Again, as I told you, this is a huge potential. It's up to the Chinese authorities to see how they can optimize it for their ambitions.
Right. So, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a very insightful conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about subjects that are related to China, especially, and I hope we can plan some more sessions in the future on similar lines.
It's delightful talking to you, Sharon, as well, with your very interesting questions. And yeah, I'm looking forward to more such interactions. And my thanks to all your viewers for patient listening.
Thank you so much. So, viewers, please do let us know what you thought about this video in the comment section below. And I'll be adding a link to Dr. Anand's article that he wrote recently for the Sunday Guardian in the description box. You can refer to the article, and I would personally encourage you to follow him on different social media handles because he's somebody who tracks activities in China very, precisely, and it will be very interesting to actually see some of his analysis, and I would urge many of you to do so. Thank you so much for staying tuned in, and looking forward to our conversations the coming week as well.